I saw the video at 11 o'clock at night. My phone buzzed, and there it was. My daughter Emma's face, tear-streaked, accusing me of hitting her. The screen glowed blue in the dark room. I watched it 3 times, each time hoping the words would change. They didn't. She said I'd shoved her into a wall last Tuesday, but I was at work that night. I have the time cards. I have the security footage from the garage. My hand trembled as I pulled up the camera app. I could end this in 10 seconds. Just upload the unedited clip and let the world see the truth. But that would destroy her. And maybe that's what she deserves. Or maybe I'm missing something. I pressed play on the video again, and this time I noticed her left wrist had a thin red mark. She's right-handed. She couldn't have done that to herself, could she? The notification banner across the top of my phone didn't stop pulsing. A former co-worker from the auto parts plant texted a link with a single question mark. 3 unread emails sat in my inbox from people I hadn't spoken to since the divorce. I set the phone face down on the scarred oak coffee table. The stale smell of yesterday's drip coffee hung in the living room, heavy and bitter. At 53, you think you've weathered the worst life has to hand you. You bury parents, you sign divorce papers, you watch the factory floor shrink as automation takes over. None of that prepares you for your own child telling thousands of strangers that you're a monster. I stood up and walked to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. My knees popped in the quiet house. For 10 years, ever since her mother moved down to Florida, it's just been the 2 of us in this brick colonial. I raised her through high school, paid for her graphic design courses, and tried my best to stay out of her way when she moved into the city. We never talked much, but I thought there was a baseline of decency between us. Apparently, I was wrong. I gripped the edge of the granite counter until my knuckles turned white. My phone buzzed again, vibrating against the wood so hard it made a rattling sound. I picked it up and saw a text from Mike, my younger brother. He's a criminal defense attorney in downtown Columbus, and he keeps banker's hours even when he's off. Turn off your phone. His message read, "Call me at 7 in the morning. Don't post anything." Mike always treated every crisis like a murder trial waiting to happen. But he didn't understand that waiting meant letting the lie settle into concrete. Every minute that video stayed online without a rebuttal, my name was sinking a little deeper into the mud. I walked over to the hallway desk and flipped open my laptop. The fan whined loudly before the desktop finally loaded. I didn't want to call Mike yet because I wanted to look at the evidence myself first. I clicked into the local storage folder connected to the home security system. The system runs 4 cameras, one at the front porch, one on the back patio, one facing the driveway, and one covering the side door that leads straight into the kitchen. Tuesday night, the date Emma mentioned in her video, was stamped clearly in the file directory. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I clicked on the side door camera file for Tuesday at 9:45 p.m. The footage opened to a static, night vision view of the doorway and the small patch of lawn beside it. The timestamp rolled forward in green digital numbers. Nothing happened for the first 20 minutes. Then, at precisely 10:14 p.m., a dark silhouette slipped into the frame from the shadows of the overgrown hydrangea bushes. It was a person wearing a heavy hooded sweatshirt, moving with a quick, nervous gait. The figure paused right by the latch of the side door, jiggling the handle before slipping out of view as the camera angle cut off. I leaned closer to the monitor, squinting through my reading glasses. The angle was high and slightly obscured by the metal gutter above, cutting off the top half of the intruder's face. I couldn't tell who it was from the hoodie and the slouch, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't home, and Emma wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this house on a Tuesday night. She lived 20 miles away in her cramped apartment downtown. I clicked the mouse to save the clip to a separate flash drive, my hands steadying out of sheer cold focus. The screen cast a harsh white glare across the family photos hanging on the wall behind the desk. There was Emma at her high school graduation, smiling awkwardly in a blue cap. There she was 10 years earlier, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. I pulled up the video of her accusation again on my phone, ignoring the fresh wave of comments pouring into the comment section. I paused it right on the frame, where she held up her wrist to show the camera. That red mark wasn't from a shove against drywall. It looked too narrow, too deliberate, like something squeezed too tight or held down hard. I picked up my phone and dialed her number directly. It rang 4 times before going straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. There was nothing left to say through a machine. I walked back to the window and looked out at the quiet suburban street under the amber glow of the municipal streetlights. The houses on either side were dark, their owners asleep, completely unaware of the wreckage happening inside my living room. I sat back down on the sofa, the flash drive clutched tightly in my hand. Mike told me to wait. I sat in my garage workshop, the cold air biting through my flannel shirt, staring down at a printed bank statement from 6 months ago. The concrete floor felt like ice beneath my work boots. On the paper, a $5,000 wire transfer stared back at me, routed straight to Emma's credit card company. I never told her I paid it off. I thought keeping it quiet would save her pride, spare her the humiliation of knowing her father had to bail her out of a mountain of interest charges. Instead, by keeping silent, I let her walk around believing I told her no when she begged for help last autumn. The silence between us had always been our loudest room. After her mother moved down to Florida, it was just the two of us rattling around this suburban house, swapping polite nods and short answers over microwave dinners. I managed the factory floor in town by barking clear, direct orders, but I never figured out how to talk to my own daughter without sounding like a foreman. When she started doing freelance graphic design and racked up those high-interest debts, she came to me with her jaw clenched, asking for a loan. I said no to her face because I wanted her to learn accountability, but behind her back, I called the bank the next morning and cleared the balance anyway. That was my mistake. I see that now. Men of my generation think providing money is the same thing as showing love, like building a sturdy fence around a yard and calling it a home. I handed over the cash quietly so she wouldn't feel small, but all I did was leave her floating in a vacuum of resentment. She walked out of my kitchen that night slamming the screen door, convinced her father was a hard-hearted miser who wouldn't lift a finger to save her. And when a person feels cornered and deeply unloved, they start believing the worst stories about the people who raised them. I folded the statement and shoved it into my back pocket, the crisp paper rustling against the denim. The garage smelled of stale gasoline and WD-40, familiar scents that usually cleared my head when the plant shifts ran long. But tonight the smell just made me sick. I walked over to my workbench, picked up a dirty shop rag, and wiped down the surface of my old drill press. My hands were steady now, hardened by decades of handling heavy machinery, but my chest felt hollow. If Emma thought I was cold enough to let her drown in debt, it isn't much of a stretch for her to believe I would shove her into a wall. That realization hit me harder than any of the hateful comments scrolling beneath her online video. I created a dynamic where she felt justified in painting me as a monster because I refused to be transparent with my own heart. Pride is a stubborn thing, especially for a 53-year-old widower who spent his whole life trying not to look weak in front of his only child. I tossed the dirty rag into the metal trash bin and walked back inside the warm house. The digital clock on the microwave glowed 1:15 a.m. My younger brother Mike, the criminal defense attorney, who usually had a cynical answer for everything, told me to sit tight and let him handle the digital forensics. But waiting has never been my strong suit. I grabbed my cell phone off the kitchen counter, my thumb hovering over Emma's contact card. I needed to clear up this misunderstanding about the money before we even began talking about the absurd abuse allegations. If she knew I paid her debt, maybe the armor she wrapped herself in would crack. Maybe we could get back to the truth. I tapped the screen to place the call, holding the phone tightly against my ear as the quiet ringing tone started. It rang 4 times, the standard hollow pulse before the carrier picked up. Then the line clicked, but instead of the automated greeting, I heard a faint rustling sound on the other end. Someone had answered, or at least picked up the phone without speaking. I opened my mouth to say her name, but a man's voice muttered something low and sharp in the background, a voice I didn't recognize. It sounded hurried, cold, and entirely too confident for the middle of the night. "Just leave it on the counter," a man said through the receiver. Before I could demand to know who was with her, the line went dead with a sharp click. I pulled the phone away and stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. That wasn't Emma speaking, and it certainly wasn't a voicemail recording. Someone else was in her apartment at 1 in the morning, and the tone of his voice made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. I paced the length of the kitchen island, dialing her number again. This time, it went straight to voicemail after a single ring. I didn't leave a message. I dropped the phone onto the laminate counter, pulled on my heavy canvas jacket, and grabbed my truck keys from the hook by the back door. The digital dash clock in my Ford F-150 read 1:28 a.m. as I backed out of the driveway without turning on the radio. Emma's apartment complex was a 40-minute drive across town, nestled near the old industrial district, where the brick warehouses had been converted into lofts. During the day, the area hummed with creative agencies and coffee shops, but at night it turned into a ghost town of deep shadows and narrow alleys. My tires hummed against the asphalt as I pushed the truck slightly above the speed limit, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I parked half a block away from her building, cutting the headlights before I killed the engine. The night air was dead silent, except for the distant hiss of a steam valve from the power plant down by the river. I walked briskly toward her entrance, my boots crunching on gravel. The main security gate stood slightly ajar, a small pebble wedged into the latch to keep it from locking. Someone had tampered with it, or left it open on purpose. I slipped through the gap and took the concrete stairwell up to the 3rd floor, skipping the elevator to avoid the mechanical hum. When I reached her door, apartment 304, I didn't knock right away. I pressed my ear against the painted wood. Inside, I heard the faint, rhythmic scratching of someone moving furniture, accompanied by the muffled rustle of plastic bags. I raised my fist and hammered 3 times against the door. The interior noises stopped instantly. A floorboard creaked close to the threshold. Then, the deadbolt turned with a heavy, metallic clunk, and the door swung open just wide enough for a sliver of light to spill across the hallway floor. I paced the length of my kitchen island, the cold quartz surface pressing against my fingertips as I held the phone to my ear. The digital clock on the microwave blinked 1:15 a.m., casting a faint, harsh glow across the empty room. On the other end of the line, Mike's breathing was steady, grounded by the clinical detachment born from 20 years of handling criminal cases in downtown Columbus. "You're not thinking clearly, Robert," Mike said, his voice cutting through the silence. "If you sit on this and let that video rack up another 10,000 shares, HR at the plant is going to see it by Monday morning. They won't wait for an investigation. They'll suspend you to protect the company's image." She's my daughter, Mike, I muttered, staring out the dark kitchen window toward the empty driveway. I can't just throw her to the wolves by posting security footage of her apartment online to prove she's lying. She threw you to the wolves first, Mike replied without missing a beat. Look at the logistics. If she really thought you pushed her last Tuesday like she claims in that clip, why didn't she call the local police? Why didn't she file a report? She went straight to TikTok and Facebook. That's not how victims act. That's how someone launching a public pressure campaign acts. His words hit me like a splash of cold water, hard and undeniable. I stopped pacing and looked down at the coffee-stained counter where my laptop sat. The unedited garage video paused on the screen. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the void as my mind wrestled with the ugliness of what my brother was suggesting. Maybe she was scared, I offered, though even to my own ears the excuse sounded hollow and pathetic. Maybe she didn't know who else to turn to. She has a phone, and she knows my number by heart, Mike said flatly. She didn't call because a police report requires evidence, and an official investigation requires statements under oath. Social media doesn't require any of that. It just requires an audience willing to hate someone before they know the facts. I rubbed the back of my neck, feeling the tight knots of tension that had built up over the last 3 hours. The air in the kitchen felt stale, carrying the faint, bitter scent of the half cup of coffee I had brewed hours ago and never drank. I hated that he was right, but the sheer absurdity of Emma's accusation kept gnawing at the edges of my common sense. I'm worried about what happens to her if I release that footage, I said, my voice dropping to a low growl. People online are ruthless. They'll dig up her address, her friends, her old jobs. And right now they're outside your front door with digital pitchforks, Mike countered. You worked 30 years at that plant to build a decent life and a clean name. You worked 20 years raising her after her mother left for Florida, working double shifts so she could go to art school. You don't owe her your reputation when she's trying to burn yours to the ground. Give me until morning, I said, my grip tightening on the phone until my knuckles ached. Let me think about it. There is no morning, Robert. The internet doesn't sleep, Mike sighed, though I could hear the reluctant softening in his tone. Fine, but don't do anything rash until we look at that garage footage together. Bring the flash drive to my office at 9 o'clock. We'll watch it frame by frame and decide our next move. All right, 9 o'clock, I said, and ended the call. I tossed the phone onto the kitchen island and stood alone in the dark, listening to the quiet ticking of the wall clock. The house felt entirely too big, echoing with memories of dinners we used to share when Emma was younger and still looked at me without that wall of resentment between us. I walked over to the back door, intending to lock the deadbolt for the night, and stopped dead in my tracks. A sharp, metallic scraping sound came from just outside the garage wall, followed by the muffled crunch of loose gravel against the concrete drive. My breath caught in my throat. I killed the overhead kitchen light, plunging myself into near-total darkness save for the pale amber glow of the porch fixture filtering through the side windows. Crouching low, I crept toward the mudroom door that connected directly to the garage. Every floorboard seemed determined to betray my steps with a loud, protesting creak. Through the wired glass pane of the interior door, I saw a beam of white light sweeping across the workbench. Someone was inside my garage. The memory of my father's heavy hunting rifle tucked away in the cabinet flashed through my mind, but I dismissed it instantly. I had no intention of escalating a midnight trespasser into a lethal tragedy. Instead, I gripped the brass handle of the heavy wooden door, turned it with agonizing slowness, and shoved it inward. A figure spun around near the back corner, startled by the motion. The beam of a heavy-duty flashlight glared directly into my eyes, blinding me. "Dad?" a trembling, defensive voice called out. The light dipped, and squinting through the glare, I saw Emma standing beside my workbench. Her face was pale, smeared with smudges of dark charcoal and dirt, and her oversized denim jacket was zipped tight against the autumn chill. In her right hand, she clutched a heavy claw hammer she must have pulled from my open toolbox. "Emma, what in God's name are you doing here at this hour?" I demanded, my fear instantly giving way to a volatile mix of exhaustion and anger. "Breaking into my house through the garage. Are you out of your mind?" She lowered the hammer, though her grip remained white-knuckled around the handle. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, avoiding my eyes. "I wasn't breaking in. I forgot my spare key to the side door ages ago, and I needed to get something. At 2 in the morning, I stepped further into the cold concrete space, crossing my arms over my chest. You live 40 minutes away in the city. You launch a viral smear campaign against me, telling thousands of strangers that I abused you, and then you sneak around my property in the middle of the night. What did you possibly need that couldn't wait until daylight?" Emma swallowed hard, her jaw tightening defensively. She pointed the flashlight toward the lower shelf of the heavy metal shelving unit, where an old cardboard banker's box sat half hidden beneath a blue tarp. "My mother's old sketchbooks," she whispered, her defiance cracking just a fraction. "And the birth certificate papers. You said you threw them out last year, but I knew you kept them down here. Someone messaged me online tonight. Someone saying they represent a digital archive for local artists. They offered to buy her unpublished charcoal pieces for $5,000. I need the money, Dad. My rent is 3 months behind, and the gallery downtown is threatening to drop my lease." The silence in the garage grew suffocating. The cold metal tools hanging on the pegboard seemed to mock the distance between us, the accumulated years of quiet sacrifice traded for a desperate transaction in the dark. "You came here to steal from me," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Not just my reputation online, but physical things out of my house, because you're in financial trouble and didn't have the decency to just pick up the phone and ask me for help." "Ask you?" Emma snapped, her voice rising sharply off the concrete walls. "You would have lectured me for an hour about budgeting and responsibility before writing a check with strings attached. You always make me feel small. The video was the only way to get people to pay attention to me, to make me visible." Visible? I stepped forward, the realization of what my brother had said earlier, finally settling into my marrow. "You didn't want visibility, Emma. You wanted leverage, and it ends right now." I turned on my heel, ignoring her sudden gasp of protest, and walked back into the brightly lit kitchen. I picked up my phone from the counter, bypassed Mike's contact, and dialed the local sheriff's non-emergency dispatch directly. When the dispatcher answered, I didn't hesitate. I gave my address, reported an active trespasser on my property, and asked for an officer to be dispatched immediately. I stood in the dark garage, flashlight in hand, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The police dispatcher's voice had barely faded from the phone before I moved toward the back door that led straight out to the concrete driveway. The cold March air hit my face instantly, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth and melting frost from the yard. I clicked the flashlight on, sweeping the narrow beam across the side of the house where the old brickwork met the wooden siding. That was when I saw them. Fresh, heavy boot prints pressed deep into the thawing mud, right beneath the garage window. They were not my footprints, and they certainly did not belong to Emma. I crouched down in the dirt, ignoring the chill seeping through the knees of my work trousers, and examined the tread pattern. The rubber soles had a distinct chevron design, jagged and deep, meant for heavy outdoor work or construction. My own boots had a flat, worn sole, smooth from years of walking on concrete factory floors. Someone had stood right here on Tuesday night, looking through the glass while I was out at the plant, peering into the very space where I kept my tools and the backup server for my security cameras. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as the pieces of the puzzle began to grind against one another in my mind. Emma had claimed the argument, and the shove happened on Tuesday evening, yet here was tangible proof of a stranger lurking outside my window at the exact same hour. I got back to my feet and pushed the side door open, stepping into the dim interior of the garage. The air smelled of old motor oil, sawdust, and the stale cardboard of storage boxes piled against the back wall. I walked over to the main control unit mounted next to the fuse box, popped open the plastic housing, and pulled the micro SD card from the secondary camera. My hands were completely steady now, replaced by a cold, surgical focus that always took over whenever a crisis demanded actual work. I carried the small chip back inside to the kitchen table, slid it into the reader plugged into my laptop, and waited for the folder directories to load on the screen. The files popped up in a neat chronological list, time-stamped down to the exact second by the system's internal clock. I scrolled past Wednesday, past Thursday, and stopped right on Tuesday night, finding the exact window of time when the motion-activated lens had recorded the exterior perimeter. I clicked on the video file labeled 11:42 p.m. and held my breath as the grainy, infrared-tinted footage began to play in the center of the display. The yard was bathed in a pale, ghostly green light, empty except for the swaying branches of the oak tree near the property line. Then, a dark figure stepped into the frame from the shadows of the fence, moving with a familiar, loose-limbed swagger that immediately made my stomach drop. It was David, Emma's boyfriend, wearing a bulky canvas jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. He didn't look like a burglar searching for valuables. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who believed he had every right to be there. He walked straight up to the garage window, cupped his hands around his face to block the ambient light from the street, and peered intently into the dark interior. After a moment, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small electronic device, and held it near the window frame for several seconds before slipping away back into the darkness. The video ran for another 2 minutes of empty yard before cutting out to the next motion trigger. I leaned back in my chair, the screen's glow washing out the lines of exhaustion on my face as I stared at the moving pixels. David had been here on Tuesday night, tampering with the window and casing the property, while Emma was supposedly at home drafting her graphic design layouts. He wasn't just a freeloading boyfriend living off her meager freelance earnings. He was an active operator, orchestrating something much darker behind her back. The red mark on her wrist, the sudden panic in her voice during our last brief phone call, and the aggressive tone of the social media video all pointed back to him. He was the one who had pushed her into a corner, burdened her with mounting debts, and then manufactured a fake domestic abuse narrative to exploit us both. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stripping away my anger toward Emma and replacing it with a cold, protective fury aimed squarely at the man who had manipulated my daughter. I reached for my phone on the wooden tabletop, my thumb hovering over my brother Mike's contact as I prepared to map out our next move. But before I could press the call button, the screen flashed with an incoming call from an unrecognized local number that immediately switched to Emma's name and photo. The phone began to vibrate against the wood, buzzing loudly in the quiet kitchen. I swiped the green answer icon and brought the receiver to my ear without a moment's hesitation. Emma's voice came through the speaker, thin, cracked, and trembling with uncontrollable sobs. "Dad, I need to see you," she whispered into the phone. the sound of rushing traffic audible in her background. Alone. Emma arrived 20 minutes later, pale and trembling as she pushed open my front door without knocking. She stood in the entryway for a long moment, clutching her oversized denim jacket tightly around her shoulders, as if she were freezing in the heated house. I offered her a cup of hot coffee, but she shook her head mutinously and wouldn't even sit down on the living room sofa. She kept pacing between the hall closet and the front window, her boots clicking softly against the hardwood floors. "You said you needed to talk," I said, leaning against the kitchen counter with my arms crossed over my chest. "Start talking." Emma stopped pacing and turned to look at me, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow from lack of sleep. "I made a huge mistake, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking before she could finish the sentence. "Everything got out of hand so fast, and I didn't know how to stop it." Instead of yelling, I pulled out a printed bank statement from my folder and slid it across the wooden dining table toward her. "You didn't know how to ask for help either," I said quietly, watching her expression shift from confusion to absolute horror as she read the numbers. "I paid off your $15,000 credit card balance last month. I took out a loan against the shop equipment so the collectors would stop calling your phone." Emma stared at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. You paid it, but David said." She cut herself off mid-sentence, her face draining of what little color it had left. "Wait, you actually paid it off?" "I didn't tell you because I thought you'd be embarrassed," I admitted, the weight of my own past mistakes pressing down on my chest. "I wanted to fix it quietly, but you listened to someone else instead of trusting me." Panic flared in her eyes, and she spun around toward the laptop, sitting open on the kitchen island. The screen was still displaying the paused security footage from the garage on Tuesday night. She stared at the timestamp in the corner of the video, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. "You have the cameras," she breathed, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "You have the whole thing recorded." Before I could answer, Emma grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself, her knees buckling slightly. "He said he'd hurt me if I didn't do it," she blurted out, tears spilling over her eyelashes as the confession finally broke through her defenses. "David told me if I didn't post the video and blame you, he'd release those private photos and ruin my career forever. He wrote the script for me, word for word." A heavy, suffocating silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. I stepped forward, my anger at David instantly replacing the last remnants of my resentment toward my daughter. "Emma, look at me," I said, reaching out to steady her shaking shoulders. "We can go to the police right now and sort this out. You are safe here." Suddenly, her cell phone buzzed violently in her jacket pocket, playing a sharp, customized ringtone that made her flinch. She pulled the device out, glanced at the screen, and the blood drained entirely from her face. "I have to go," she whispered, panic overriding her reason as she backed away from my outstretched hand. "If I don't answer him, he said he'll come looking for me." "Don't you dare walk out that door," I said, stepping forward to block her path to the hallway. "We finish this together, right now." "I can't," she sobbed, ducking past my arm with a desperate burst of speed. The front door flew open, slamming against the drywall with a loud bang, and then the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her. I stood alone in the hallway, listening to the rapid crunch of her boots sprinting down the concrete walkway toward the driveway. A few seconds later, the engine of her compact car roared to life, tires spinning gravel against the curb as she sped away into the night. I walked slowly back to the kitchen and stared down at the laptop screen. With trembling fingers, I closed the editing software and pulled up the raw, uncompressed video file from the garage camera directory. I hit play and watched the grainy black and white footage of Tuesday night roll forward at normal speed. The side door clicked open and a tall figure slipped into the dim shadows near the storage shelves. The motion sensor overhead clicked on, flooding the garage with harsh white light for 3 long seconds. The figure turned directly toward the lens, and the face came into sharp, unmistakable focus. It was David. He was holding his own phone up, recording a video of himself grabbing his own left wrist and squeezing hard enough to leave a bright red mark against his skin. I uploaded the edited garage footage at 2 in the morning, my finger hovering over the publish button for a long, agonizing minute. I had carefully blurred Emma's face throughout the clip, protecting her identity while leaving the timestamp and David's unmistakable features completely exposed. My caption was intentionally short and devoid of emotion or defensive ranting. It simply read, "The truth, no edits. Check the timestamp against my work schedule." Within 20 minutes, the view count ticked past 1,000, driven by the algorithms picking up the sudden surge of traffic from my previous viral posts. I sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of black coffee, watching the comments refresh themselves every few seconds. At first, the skeptics doubled down, calling the blur a cheap trick or accusing me of deep-faking the timestamp. But then a user who worked the night shift at the local auto plant chimed in, confirming that my supervisor badge had scanned the turnstile at the exact minute shown on the video. The tide of public opinion shifted with a sudden, violent speed that left me breathless. Comments defending me began appearing by the hundreds, burying the original accusations under a mountain of digital outrage directed squarely at the blurry figure in my garage. More importantly, people began dissecting the second man in the clip, zooming in on his posture, his clothing, and the specific way he handled his phone. By 3 o'clock, amateur internet sleuths had pulled up public social media profiles, matching David's exact build and clothing from older posts. My phone buzzed constantly against the wooden tabletop, a relentless stream of notifications that I finally silenced by flipping the device face down. Mike called twice in rapid succession, but I didn't answer because there was nothing left to debate right now. The digital bullet had left the barrel, and no amount of legal caution could pull it back. I walked over to the kitchen sink and splashed cold water on my face, staring into the small mirror above the basin at my bloodshot eyes and deep-set wrinkles. Around 4 in the morning, my phone lit up the dark room with a text message from an unknown number containing a single screen capture. It was a screenshot of David's public Instagram account, where dozens of angry commenters had already swarmed his recent photos with accusations and threats. I felt a grim, hollow satisfaction wash over me, stripped of any real triumph because I knew my daughter's life was currently burning down alongside his. The immediate fallout demanded a physical response rather than another online post. I pulled on a heavy canvas jacket, retrieved my car keys from the bowl by the front door, and drove down to the 24-hour diner near the industrial park to clear my head before daylight broke. The diner was empty, except for a night shift trucker nursing a mug at the counter and a waitress wiping down laminate tables with a damp rag. I ordered a black coffee I had no intention of drinking, using the sterile fluorescent-lit booth as neutral territory to process what came next. By sitting there among strangers, I forced myself to accept that my domestic sanctuary was temporarily gone, replaced by the relentless scrutiny of a public trial. At 6 o'clock, I drove back home. The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting the suburban lawn in pale, muted shades of grey and frost. I had just stepped through the front door when the doorbell rang, its sharp chime cutting through the quiet house like a knife. I walked down the hallway with measured steps, my muscles tensed for another confrontation, and pulled the door open without checking the peephole. 2 local police officers stood on my front porch, their heavy utility belts catching the morning light. The older one, a sergeant with graying temples and tired eyes, held a clipboard against his chest. He looked at me with a practiced, neutral expression that revealed absolutely nothing about why they were standing on my doorstep at dawn. "Mr. Robert," the sergeant asked, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm Sergeant Miller with the Columbus Police Department. We need you to come down to the downtown precinct with us right away." I gripped the edge of the door frame, my knuckles aching from the sudden pressure. "Is this about the video online? I have the unedited backups right here on my computer if you need them." "It's not about the video, sir," the sergeant replied, shifting his weight onto his back foot. "We picked up David an hour ago based on the trespassing and extortion reports. But your daughter Emma is down at the station as well, and she's currently refusing to press charges against him." The cold reality of her psychological entanglement hit me harder than any accusation ever could. I grabbed my car keys off the hallway table again without a word, gesturing for the officers to lead the way to my own vehicle. Following their cruiser through the brightening downtown streets, my mind raced past the public vindication of the internet and collided squarely with the stubborn, fragile loyalty of a teenager under the spell of an abuser. At the precinct reception desk, a tired-looking intake officer pointed us toward a row of molded plastic chairs outside the temporary interview rooms. Sergeant Miller unlocked an interior glass door and motioned for me to step into a small, windowless consultation room where Emma sat huddled in an oversized grey hoodie, her arms wrapped tightly around her torso. Her hair was unwashed, and she refused to look up as the heavy metal door clicked shut behind me. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of defiance and profound exhaustion. "You shouldn't have posted that. You've ruined everything." I didn't answer her accusation right away. I pulled out one of the hard plastic chairs across the metal table, the legs scraping loudly against the linoleum floor, and sat down. She looked smaller than 25 years old, sitting there under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the precinct room. Her oversized grey hoodie swallowed her frame, and her knuckles were bruised purple where she must have gripped something too hard earlier that morning. "You think I ruined your life by showing the garage footage?" I asked, keeping my voice lower than I felt. "David set you up, Emma. He manipulated your debts. He used your phone to post that video, and he manufactured an abuse charge so he could try to extort me." Emma flinched, pulling her knees up against her chest inside the hoodie pocket. "You don't understand how bad things got," she whispered, staring fixedly at a scratch on the grey laminate table. "He said if I didn't help him get money from you, he would make sure everyone online knew every single mistake I've ever made. I thought I was protecting myself." She buried her face in her arms, her shoulders shaking with quiet, exhausted sobs. The defiance she usually wore like a shield had entirely vanished, leaving behind a terrified young woman who was completely overwhelmed by her own choices. I reached across the cold metal surface and placed my hand over her arm. She didn't pull away, but she stayed curled into herself, refusing to meet my eyes. "You should have called me," I said, the words heavy and clumsy in my throat. "Even if you thought I'd be angry about the debts. Even if you thought I wouldn't understand. You always lecture me," she sobbed softly into her sleeve. "You make everything about rules and responsibility." "I thought I was protecting you," I admitted, looking down at the worn skin of my own hands. "Back when I took out that bank loan to pay off your first round of credit cards without telling you, I thought I was saving you from the interest rates. I was just protecting my own pride, because I didn't want to admit my daughter was struggling. Emma stopped crying for a second, her head tilting up slightly as she looked at me through red, swollen eyes. You paid those off. The collection agency didn't just drop it. I borrowed $5,000 from the credit union 3 months ago, I said quietly. I never told you because I didn't want you to feel embarrassed. I was wrong. I should have talked to you instead of acting like a silent partner in your life. She stared at me in disbelief, the realization sinking in slowly through the fog of her fear and exhaustion. The silence in the small windowless room stretched out, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the faint hum of the building's ventilation system overhead. I'm so sorry, Dad, she whispered, her voice cracking completely as a fresh tear spilled down her cheek. I messed up everything. We'll fix it, I said, squeezing her arm gently. David is going away for extortion, and we are going to figure out your finances together, without any secrets. She nodded slowly, wiping her face with the sleeve of her hoodie. She looked down at the table for a long moment, picking nervously at a loose thread on her cuff, before she finally looked up at me. Can we start over? She asked, her voice small and fragile. 2 days later, the formal release paperwork cleared, and I drove her back to her small apartment. The place smelled faintly of stale coffee and damp cardboard. Unopened mail still cluttered the entryway table where David had tossed it weeks ago. Emma stood awkwardly in the center of the living room, hugging a faded blue throw pillow to her chest, as if bracing herself against an impact that never came. Instead of waiting for her to break down, I set her duffel bag by the sofa and walked straight to the kitchen. I began sorting through the recycling bin, clearing away the empty energy drink cans and takeout boxes that cluttered the counter. You don't have to clean for me, she murmured from the doorway, her voice tight with leftover shame. I'm not cleaning for you, I replied without stopping. I'm clearing a workspace. Tomorrow morning, we are sitting down with your bank statements and a calculator. No lecturing, just arithmetic and a calendar. Emma watched me for a long moment, the tension in her shoulders easing by a fraction. She walked over, set the pillow down on the couch, and picked up a stack of past-due utility notices. She didn't open them, but she laid them neatly on the kitchen island next to my coffee mug. It was a small, practical gesture, but it meant more than any apology. The following Tuesday, we made our first trip to the credit counselor downtown. The office was cramped and smelled of old paper and mint tea, run by a retired accountant named Miller who didn't care about family drama or digital scandals. Miller laid out a rigid 3-year debt management plan, looking over our shoulders as we mapped out every dollar of Emma's freelance income and my supplemental workshop earnings. It's going to be tight, Miller said, sliding a printed budget sheet toward Emma. No luxuries, and every single paycheck has an assigned destination. But it is entirely manageable. Emma looked down at the numbers, her pen hovering over the signature line. For the first time in years, the columns balanced. The anxiety that had driven her into David's orbit was still present, but now it had boundaries, walls, and an exit strategy. She signed her name with a steady hand, sliding the document back across the desk. By evening, we were back at her apartment, eating a quiet dinner of leftover soup at the narrow kitchen table. The street lamps outside flickered on through the dusty window panes, casting long, calm shadows across the floorboards. I talked to my landlord about breaking the lease early, Emma said, staring into her bowl. Once we have the first month's deposit for a smaller place, closer to your side of town, I can help with the moving truck, I said. She looked up, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth, the first one I had seen in months. The silence between us remained heavy with the wreckage of everything we had hidden from each other, But it was no longer a barrier. It was a beginning. I was standing in the kitchen, wiping down the laminate counter with a damp sponge, when the turntable on the old stereo finished its side and the needle lifted with a soft click. The sudden silence in the house felt clean, unlike the heavy tension that had lived in these rooms for the past week. A moment later, the doorbell rang, its single chime echoing down the hallway. I dropped the sponge into the sink and dried my hands on a dish towel, my steps slow against the hardwood floor. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I recognized the familiar, slight silhouette standing on the porch. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Emma stood there in her worn denim jacket, holding a cardboard bakery box tied with a white cotton string. She looked tired, the dark circles under her eyes still visible, but her posture lacked the defensive stiffness I had grown used to seeing over the last year. "Hey," she said, looking down at the welcome mat before meeting my gaze. "I bought a cherry pie from that bakery off Main Street, the one you used to take me to on Saturdays." "Come on in," I said, stepping aside and holding the door wide. "The kitchen's warm. Let me make some coffee." The visit wasn't announced, and it wasn't part of any grand reconciliation plan my brother Mike had drawn up on his legal pads. It was just a quiet Sunday afternoon in late March, with the suburban wind rattling the bare branches of the oak tree in the front yard. Emma placed the bakery box on the kitchen table and untied the string, folding the cardboard flaps back to reveal a dusted lattice crust. I busied myself with the coffee maker, listening to the familiar gurgle of water hitting the heating element and the rhythmic hiss of steam. We didn't talk about David, and we didn't mention the internet videos or the police station interrogation rooms. Instead, she asked about the transmission noise my truck had been making, and I told her about the worn-out bushing I planned to replace next Saturday. "You always leave that truck half disassembled in the driveway," she said, cutting a wedge of pie with the butter knife. "It gives the neighbors something to look at besides their own lawns," I replied, setting 2 ceramic mugs of black coffee on the table. We sat across from each other, the space between us smaller than it had been in years. The pie was sweet and tart, tasting almost exactly like the ones we used to share when she was 12, before the silences between us started to stretch out for weeks at a time. The conversation stayed on safe shores, her freelance design clients, the progress she was making on the budget spreadsheet, and the smaller apartment she planned to rent near the park. It wasn't a magical fix, and the memory of what had happened still sat heavily in the back of my mind. Trust didn't return all at once like a snapped rubber band. It came back in tiny, unforced increments, measured in shared coffee and ordinary words. When the mugs were empty and the pie tin was half empty, Emma looked at her watch and stood up from the table. She zipped her denim jacket up to her collar and walked toward the front door, her boots clicking softly against the floor. I followed her into the small foyer, watching as she reached for the brass doorknob. She hesitated for a second, her fingers resting on the metal, before turning back to look at me. "Dad, I'm sorry for everything," she said, her voice dropping to a quiet, steady murmur. I nodded, feeling a tight knot in my chest loosen just a fraction. "I know, me too." The door closed softly behind her, sealing shut with a muffled click. I stood in the quiet hallway for a long moment, listening through the wood as the starter on her compact car cranked twice before the engine caught. The tires crunched against the gravel of the driveway, and then the sound faded away down the street, leaving the house completely still once again.